Autonomous cars have the potential to transform the way we live our lives and do business. They'll be safer and more organized than human drivers, they'll never get drunk, they're capable of calculating advanced trajectories instantaneously, and their reaction times are a tiny fraction of that of a human's. These are some of the reasons that very few people reject the reality that in the future, most humans will not be allowed to drive human-controlled cars on public roads. But autonomous cars are fundamentally disruptive to the status quo. Not only do they automate away millions of jobs, they make entire industries obsolete. Every dollar you save because of a reduction in your cost of living is a dollar not earned by the powers that be, and that's the reason you won't be allowed to own one. I'm going to lead into this topic by talking a little bit about Uber. Before Uber, we had to rely on taxis for our transportation. And of course, taxis, if you know anything about the industry and taxis almost everywhere in the world, it's a very highly regulated industry, and they pay a lot of money to lobbyists to keep competition out. And taxis are notorious for price gouging. So I've heard in some cities you have to pay like $50 a ride or something like that minimum. I mean, I've paid $50 for a taxi to go from downtown to uptown in Toronto. So Uber comes in and they disrupt the taxi industry by allowing anyone to be a taxi. Of course, you're not considered a taxi by these arbitrary legal definitions, but you're allowed to compete against the taxi industry. So you can run your own little miniature taxi business, and that has dramatically dropped the price of taxi prices everywhere in the city. Now, Uber is great because they compete against taxis, but they can't really compete against public transit. They can't compete against buses and trains. The reason for that is because buses and trains are able to carry many more passengers. That being said, if you're carpooling with a few other people, the price of taking an Uber is somehow comparable to taking a bus in many places, depending on what city you're in. And I think that the reason for that is because the public transit in most cities is monopolized. Autonomous cars actually solve this problem because they do to the public transit what Uber has done for taxis. Essentially, it would allow any person to own a car to send the car out to do work for you, and you can have your own personal taxi service. So if you own a car or you have a fleet of cars, and I'm sure there's going to be entrepreneurs out there that have hundreds of cars roaming the streets of the city, looking for passengers, picking them up, dropping them off, and you're going to be able to compete against public transit very effectively, and you don't have to have a driver driving these things. So most of the price of this operation, which is the price of labor, is completely removed out of the equation, and then all you have to worry about is the price of the car itself, as well as the price of fuel and maybe insurance and a few other expenses. By removing the human out of the equation, you actually reduce expenses greatly, and so what that does is it creates a really interesting market pressure where now it might actually be cheaper to take a taxi. And of course, they're not going to be taxis; they're going to be, just a car share. So you're going to share someone's car. It'll be cheaper to do that than to own a car long term. Now, if you take a taxi every day to work, it's cheaper for you probably to just buy a car or to rent a car. But because it's expensive to take taxis, especially if you're living in a place where taxis are very expensive. But if you're using autonomous cars, see, once everyone has an autonomous car on the road and they're sharing it with other people, you're going to have a lot of competition for these for customers, and so people are going to have to compete on price. So customers are going to go with the service that gets them the best price, and maybe the service that has the best availability as well, and that's a big part of it. But there'll always be the ability for entrepreneurs to compete on price when it comes to these autonomous cars. That's going to drive the price of car sharing down. Now, eventually, there's going to come a point where it's just cheaper not to own a car. You could just rent someone else's car, borrow someone else's car for the day, and there's going to be so many cars on the road that you can borrow that the price is going to be like dirt cheap, and the availability will be super high. You need a car, it'll be there in 5 minutes, it'll pick you up, drop you off, and it's fast, it's safe, it's efficient. But on the other end, if you buy a car, it's like $30,000 or something like that, and it's going to be really expensive. So the market pressure that this is going to create is that fewer people will buy cars. Now, when something like this happens, the companies producing cars have a couple options. One option that these car companies have is that they can just produce fewer cars. So they can say, well, people aren't buying as many cars today. They're taking autonomous cars, so we're just going to continue selling cars at the same price and just sell fewer cars. It turns out that's a really expensive option because they might have to shut down entire factories in order to do that, and so that's a lot of wasted investment. And then you're going to have an industry shift where some car manufacturers might even go out of business. If that happens, those companies that decide to continue the status quo, to sell their cars for $30,000 or $40,000, assuming that that's going to be the price of an electric autonomous car, that those companies will go out of business and they'll be replaced by companies who opt to lower the price of their cars. So this is the reason I think that it's almost inevitable that the price of cars is going to go down in the future. Because once people decide that it's cheaper for them just to subscribe to a ride-sharing program, they won't need to own a car anymore. There'll be no point to it. And as a result of that, inefficiencies in the auto sector are going to be weeded out. Most notably, this includes unionized labor and car dealerships. And again, if this transition just doesn't happen, if let's say all the car companies decide that they're all going to price fix and none of them are going to compete on price, then the entire industry will all collapse because it's a byproduct of the fact that their own product is competing against them. Autonomous cars are a cannibalistic product. But once these cars get into the hands of entrepreneurs, there's nothing that you can really do. People are going to use them to car share, and that's going to really take a toll on these car manufacturers. So they're going to have to compete on price. There's no choice about it, and it's completely inevitable. So all of these inefficiencies in the car industry, the car dealerships, which by the way in the United States and in a lot of places, car companies are not allowed to sell their cars directly. They have to sell it through a dealer who adds a ton of markup to the car. College Humor did a whole spiel on this where they exposed the inflated prices and the inefficiency caused by these car dealers and how corrupt the industry is and how they lobby to prevent car companies from being able to sell their own cars. That's all going to go away. It has to. If it doesn't, the industry will collapse in on itself because people will just stop buying cars. And once that happens, the car companies are going to have to compete on price, and that means that they're going to be selling their cars for cost at the cost of manufacturing plus a small amount of margins as low as possible. And hopefully, with any luck, it's going to bring the free market to the auto industry. And the free market hasn't existed in the auto industry, so it'll be nice to have the price go down. But it's going to also put a lot of people out of work, not just the people who drive trucks or the people who drive taxis. Yes, they'll all lose their jobs, but also all the people manufacturing the cars, they're all going to be put out of work, because these car companies are going to have to really compete against car sharing on price. And if that means automating their workforce, they're going to do it. And unfortunately, we live in a world where manual labor happens to be priced very uncompetitively compared with autonomous manufacturing. And another industry that's going to be disrupted by autonomous cars that many people probably don't even think about is car insurance. Well, I have a friend who works in the insurance industry. He's a lawyer and he does claims against his insurance company. And I was actually just speaking with him yesterday, and he was telling me that his industry is going to be disrupted by autonomous cars, because what's going to happen is instead of people suing negligent drivers, people are just going to sue negligent manufacturers. That means you're not going to need insurance, and that means that the entire car insurance industry is all going to collapse because of the autonomous car, or at least that's the rumor that's going around in that industry. This is something that I really wanted to talk about. Something that really pisses me off is when people say that all these job losses are bad for the economy. No, they're not. It's the opposite. This is a good thing for the economy. There's a story that Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist, was visiting China, and he was touring a construction site when they were building a new canal. And he noticed that all the workers were using shovels to dig the canal instead of using high-end machinery. So when he asked the person in charge, that person responded that, well, you don't understand, this is a jobs program. To which Milton replied, oh, I thought that you were trying to build a canal. If it's jobs you want, then you should give these workers spoons, not shovels. The moral of the story is that jobs don't have an intrinsic value in the economy. What really matters is productivity. Now, I find that people just don't understand that. But if you have a machine that can do the job of human and you hire the human anyway, you might as well just use the machine and pay the person to come into work and sit there and do nothing all day and go home and still pay them a paycheck. It's counterproductive. There's no point of having that. Free up that human. They can go out and they can contribute to the economy in other ways. Maybe that person who you lay off is going to go and start a business. And there's another effect. If you're using autonomous solutions to compete on price, everyone's price of living goes down. So, in the example of a canal, that might be funded by taxpayer dollars. So if you can charge people less money on their taxes, that means they have more disposable income. That means that's more money that can be spent in the economy. And it's money that actually gets spent in a productive way. Instead of paying people to dig up a canal with spoons, you're actually paying someone to cook you food, or you're paying for an experience, or you're paying for, if all your necessities of life are taken care of, then you can pay for people to produce arts. And there's a lot of other ways in the economy that you can spend that money. But if your prices go down because corporations or government are behaving productively and efficiently, then it stimulates the economy. It doesn't harm the economy. So it's actually good to lay people off. And people just don't understand that. They think that a lost job is bad for the economy. No, it's good for the economy. These are counterproductive jobs, right? Like one of the big barriers to entry, by the way, of getting a job is getting to work. How do you get to work? You have to take public transit, and public transit is bloody expensive. And taking a taxi is expensive, and owning a car is expensive. If you can get rid of these industries and replace them with a more efficient industry or more streamlined and automated industry, that's really good because it allows people to get to work. And again, that contributes to your disposable income. So you have more money to spend on luxury. So your quality of life goes up. So, I hate when people say that this is bad for the economy. It's so good for the economy that and people don't get it. But this next industrial revolution that we could be facing is threatened by government. And when I say that the price of autonomous cars could go down, it really depends on whether or not the government comes in and prevents that from happening, which I strongly suspect that they will try. It's this idea that people are freaking out. They're worried that people are going to lose their jobs and it's going to be disruptive to the economy because they don't understand the full scope of the economics. All they see is the seen effect of people losing their jobs. They don't see the unseen effect where it actually it creates more jobs and more productivity long term, and it stimulates the economy. They don't see that, and so people are screaming and crying, government, regulate it, tax these autonomous cars, prevent the free market from doing its thing and jack up the price of cars and protect us from progress. You're going to see the government come in. They're going to be regulating the hell out of autonomous cars. They're going to regulate who can produce autonomous cars as much as possible. They're going to put all kinds of restrictions on it. Of course, that's going to increase the price of cars, even though the price should be going down. And then the taxes. They're going to tax the shit out of these autonomous cars. You're going to have an enormous tax on the cost of a car. And the reason that the government will say they're doing this is because it protects the workers. It protects the people whose jobs are going to be eliminated. They can be retrained to enter the workforce. But of course, that's completely ridiculous. What's really going to happen is the government's going to use those tax revenues to maintain their operations. The government has a lot of employees, and government gets a lot of their money from the car industry. And already, these autonomous cars that are coming out, they're all electric vehicles. They're all going to be electric. They're switching off of fossil fuels. Oh, and I could do a whole video on the government role in fossil fuel production. I mean, what they do is they tax you at the pump, and then they turn around and spend that money on subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. It almost seems like a scam, and people vote for that. They want the government to be taxing fossil fuels, but what they don't realize is what they're allowing the government to be a monopolistic fossil fuel dealer. I actually think that it holds back renewable technologies like solar. It backfires when government is underhandedly also supporting the oil industry that they claim they're trying to phase out. You know, it's these energy companies that monopolize on the fact that there's very little competition allowed in the energy sector. But anyway, again, I could go on about this. It's all a big scam. But anyway, back to the topic that I was talking about. When the price of these autonomous cars goes down, the government is losing out on a lot of tax revenues, and so there's an incentive for them to jack up the prices artificially using a tax. And if they don't do that, then how are they going to pay for all their massive workforce? They have to pay for all these unionized teachers. They have to pay for the garbage collectors. They have to pay for firefighters. They have to pay for health workers. They have to pay for nurses. They have to pay for all these workers, and they can't do it if their income gets cut. They have to have that income coming in. And meanwhile, if we allow the prices to go down as a result of automation, the average person will be able to live comfortably while making less money. The theory here is if prices go down but your wages go down because of the reduction in prices, you can still live comfortably and have all the necessities of life paid for and buy luxuries, and you can probably have a higher quality of life. And that works in the private sector, but it doesn't work in the public sector because the government can't reduce people's wages in the public sector because they're so heavily unionized and the contracts prevent them from doing that, and they can't lay people off. That's impossible. So where are they going to get the tax revenue from? This is what happened in Venezuela. The government owned the oil industry, and they were using that to fund their big, massive government. And then guess what? The oil revenues went away, and then the government collapsed. And so did all the social programs that people were relying on, like food stamps. I can't see this not happening. The government's going to have to step in, and they're going to have to impose a ridiculous automation tax. It's basically going to hold back this next industrial revolution. It's really unfortunate because I think we're really on the cusp of something great. But it's going to be so counterproductive because we're afraid of progress. We want to hold back the technology, but it's going to monopolize it, and it's going to put it in the hands of a few companies instead of allowing all people to prosper from what's to come. The regulations that will inevitably be imposed by government are only going to result in crony capitalistic monopolies. For example, a worst case scenario would be that only a limited number of companies are allowed to produce autonomous cars, and then instead of selling them to consumers, they just decide we're going to produce these cars and then we're going to not sell them, we're only going to lease them out. So we're going to run all the car sharing programs so there's no competition, and then they can just charge whatever they want. They can charge even more than what you would have to pay if you were to buy a car because it's all going to be over-regulated and there won't be any competitive forces to bring the prices down. I first made this prediction last year, and look what surfaced in February of this year. So Uber wants to have a monopoly on autonomous taxis. And I have another prediction. That's exactly what will happen. Our goal for society shouldn't be to create as many jobs as possible. It should be to create as much value as possible, to create as much productivity as possible. And if that means reducing prices by getting rid of unnecessary labor, that pulls everybody up, including the poor people. This is going to lower the price of food if we let it, but people are holding it back because they're afraid to let go. And the same thing happened in the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s and 1800s. But the Industrial Revolution happened, and we all benefited from it. Instead of working in the coal mines, working in the fields, or worrying where you're going to get your next meal from if the provider of the household gets sick, people were able to transition into much safer work and much more comfortable work. Anyway, guys, I just wanted to put that out there as food for thought. Please share this video with your friends to get the message out there, and subscribe for more JS Economics.